So, welcome to Coffee and Poets. It's May 14th. I'm Bob Stanley here at Twin Lotus Thai in Sacramento. Our producer is Lawrence Dinkins, and I'm here with Tom Macshery, the novelist, the poet, the teacher, the bookstore guru, also an NBA star, and a good friend of mine. And we're very happy to have Tom here to talk about writing, poetry, maybe a little basketball. Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. It's not a coincidence, but number 14 was my number when I played. So here we are in the 14th with number 14.
Today's your day, and
that's it.
And that was retired by the Warriors.
Right, it is.
It's also on the cover of your book. I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Clear Path, the book that came out last year, end of last year, beginning of this year.
Yeah, and then you guys just did a fabulous job at the book. I love it, and I refer to it a lot, and there's some wonderful poems in there. I think it might be some of the best sport poems I've ever written, and I'm not writing a lot of sports poems these days, but that might be the culmination of all the sport poems that I've written.
This one, and I like to do spontaneous stuff, so I just came upon a poem in Clear Path, and it's called Playground 1954.
That's a long time ago.
Well, yes, indeed. It's the epigraph is for playground friends. I'm going to read Playground 1954. Wooden backboards, chain link nets, cracked asphalt. Once, a single dandelion no one bothered to pluck somehow survived our Converse Keds. Who'd heard of the NBA? We aspired, if we aspired at all, to high school champs, to scholarships. I became a fireman. For 30 years, climbed ladders, put out fires, and retired with a pension. Yesterday, with grandchildren watching, I sank a free throw. The backboard was glass. The nets swished white cord. It all came back. Chain links, wooden backboards, cracked asphalt, yellow, victorious, dandelion.
Yeah, the dandelion won in the end, as nature always will, you know. And this the persona in this poem is actually a longtime friend of mine who went on to become the fire chief of San Jose, and pretty darn good basketball player himself.
Yeah, I realized about halfway through that it wasn't you, because you did make it in the NBA, and he went on to be a fireman. So it sounds like, and you stayed in touch all those years.
I love firemen. Anyway, my wife's grandson, Jackson, is going to graduate from fire department school this end of May, and we're going to cheer him on. He's going to have a uniform, and he's going to save lives, we hope.
That's great. And you have a lot of grandchildren?
Well, I have 6 on my own in our first marriage, and then I've adopted Mel's. She's got 5, and so we've got a bunch of grandchildren. They're all darling, of course.
I bet. Yeah.
What else could they be?
Yeah. And any of you play basketball with any of them?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you asked. I might finally have my basketball player, Bob. I've got my only basketball player was my daughter, but there was no WNBA at that time when she was playing. So she went on to become a linguist, and she's now a principal of Loyalton High School, and a big supporter of basketball and sports at her high school. But my son married a little bit later, and he has a 13-year-old son, just 13, and he is obsessed with basketball. He just loves basketball. When the Warriors won the championship 3 years ago, when they had a parade down Market Street, and Melanie and I we've always been invited to their parades. So it's been a lot of fun. We were driving in one of those cars down Market Street, and I'm going through all this memory stuff, which is great and enjoyable. And we had asked Matthew and Leo, and they were living in the Bay Area at the time, to join us. So Leo and Matthew sat up on the back. It was a convertible and sat up in the back. Leo would jump down and run up Market Street and shake hands with the players and shake hands with Rick Barry. And he had long blonde hair, and he was only about 10 years old at that time. And he just was running up and down, and I think and just had a whale of a time. And the next morning, after he woke up, he went into the kitchen where his mother was cooking, and he said, "Mom, that was the very best day of my whole life." So I think he got the bug. They moved to Tennessee. My son is a musician, and his wife is a musician. They're singers, and they do a little rockabilly, and they do some nice, country rock kind of music in Nashville. Nashville also has a really nice basketball program, and Leo is in it, and he's going to be the starting guard on the 8th grade team next year. So Nell and I are saving up for tickets. We might have to fly back there.
So you've told me in the past that basketball was kind of your way of becoming an American. You were born in Harbin, China.
Correct.
To Russian parents.
Correct.
Then you were captured by Japanese, and you spent 4 years in an internment camp during World War II.
That's true.
Then your family came to San Francisco. So you're a Russian 7-year-old, 8-year-old?
I'm a 7-year-old. I'm a 7-year-old. I had my 7th birthday, October, and we came in on a troop ship under the Golden Gate Bridge. I think it was August or September. So yeah, I turned 7.
In 45.
Yes, right after the war.
Right after the war ended.
Right. Yeah, my father had already come to the United States. My mother worked for the American consulate in Harbin, and she spoke 3 or 4 different languages, and she had secretarial skills and so on. So she wangled a visa for one person for my dad. So he came ahead of us. So he was already in San Francisco, waiting for us to return, and had no idea. They lost complete communication with us, my sister and my mother. So he didn't know where we were alive or not. And he didn't find out that we were alive until we got to a Red Cross station in the Philippines. And a newspaper man interviewed my mother, realized that her husband, Nick, was in San Francisco, and he was from the Call Bulletin, the newspaper in San Francisco, and he hunted my father down, and he said, "Mr. Macshery, your wife and your 2 children are alive in the Philippines, and they'll be arriving in San Francisco."
Wow!
So we were reunited in 45.
And so you grew up after that. You grew up in San Francisco. So, and basketball was one way that you kind of.
Yeah, true. And I think immigrants seek ways to embrace the country that they are bound to in some ways. They're not going to go back to Russia. We certainly were displaced persons. So I particularly was looking to be as American as I could be. So I was, I would go to movies, and then I would come home and try and speak like James Cagney, and and I would come back and I'd talk like Burt Lancaster, and
So that's how you learned English.
Sure, absolutely, and of course, when I didn't speak English very well when I came to the United States, and it was just about the start of the McCarthy period. It was within another 3 or 4 years, it was full blossom McCarthyism, and so kids being kids, I didn't get a lot of pats on the back for being Macshery. So my father changed his name to Macshery. We were Macshery, so that I could be anything. So it was kind of nice that I didn't have to be a Macshery. But we all knew, we were Russian, and we were looked down upon. Everybody thought everybody in the United States was, if you're a Russian, you're a communist. You're a pinko. You're better red than dead. It was kind of frightening. My sister was very, very strong, and she just, put her foot down. I asked her one time, because I'm just finished a memoir that's going to come out, and I asked Anne once, I said, "Anne, how did you handle that back then?" Because I was just terrified. I was terrified, and she said, "It just made me stronger. It made me feel like, I could do, I could be better than these people, And so she had a very strong attitude. I was a little more cowardly, and when I finally got the chance to play basketball, in the 7th grade, and I just took to it. I was always athletic. I played tennis. I was tall. I was, had good musculature. I was sort of primed to be an athlete, I think. But basketball just sort of caught me. The playground director set up a little tournament in the 8th grade, and he went on to show me how to play the game. His name is Cappy Lavin, and his son, Steve Lavin, coached UCLA for about 10 years. But Cappy was a great player for USF, and he was also turned out to be an English teacher. So, and I turned out to be an English teacher. It's kind of interesting how things work out. But I won that. I won that little tournament, and I got a little gold trophy. And I just knew from that point on that I was going to play ball. That was it. And I became. I tend to be real stubborn and obsessive about things, and that's sort of how I got to it. Whenever I wasn't in school, my mother knew where I was. There was a playground up the street, and I was there shooting hoops.
And this was in the Richmond district?
No, we went to the Richmond district later on. This was our first home was out on Clay Street, which was Clay and Broderick, which was lower Pacific Heights, just sort of borderline between the very rich kids up in the Pacific Heights and the sort of the less rich kids, below Clay Street. Clay Street was sort of the borderline street. And I would have gone to Emerson Elementary, which was with kids that were sort of our financial, sort of our financial status. But I was on the side of the street that took me up to Pacific Heights. So here I was, this Russian kid in his short pants and couldn't speak English very well. And I had to walk up to Pacific Heights, up to the top of the hill, to go to Grant Elementary School with all the rich kids. So, and that was fun because, I had to take care of myself. And being an athlete was one way. And actually, I sort of knew that I was headed for sports because the first time I really understood what it meant to the other kids was in a kickball game during recess. And I think I was in the 6th grade maybe, or a 5th grade. And I kicked the ball all the way over the fence, out onto the street, onto Pacific Avenue. And from then on, all the kids were like choosing me up, first. And I thought, oh, okay, I understand this. If I can kick the ball over the fence, I get to be number one. So I'm not a fool. So I just I think I just gravitated. I started playing every sport, tennis, anything I could get my hands on, anything that was athletic, I was willing to do because I knew that that's how you got to be an American. And today, look at, how do you become an American? You sing better, you dunk better, you're in Broadway, this is how, and I think a lot of the kids
you
who are coming
avoid
across,
taxes better?
Pardon me?
You avoid taxes better, you steal better? No.
Sure.
Sorry, that was for our producer.
That's exactly right. It was a very, very weird time during the 1950s, the Korean War, and I survived, and then I started high school basketball, and from that point on, there was nothing holding me back. I would be, I went on from that point to. I had a terrific. I went to Lowell High School, and it was in my district, and we had a coach, Ben Neff, who was really an icon basketball coach in San Francisco, and I just became a very good player. I grew very rapidly. I was a mid-year student. I started school in January, and over that summer I grew almost 6 inches.
Oh, that would be good for basketball.
Yeah, except that the doctor put me in bed.
Oh.
Yeah, and my bones were aching, and he was recommended steak and half milk. So I spent the summer in bed growing. I was like a potted plant. So when I got back to my high freshman year at Lowell High School, I was already 6'6.5", and I didn't grow very much after that. The programs always listed me out at 6'7" or 6'6", but I was that height when I got there. And then from that point on, it was high school. They're pretty standard stuff for guys who are obsessed with sports. It was high school All-American, college All-American, drafted by the NBA in '61.
So that's quite a basketball story. And then from basketball, right? 10 years in the NBA or 11 years?
10 years.
10 years. All-star 1 year. Mostly you were with the Warriors. You had a year or two with Seattle.
Right, 4 years with Seattle.
4 years. Okay.
Yeah, 6 years with the Warriors, 4 years with Seattle.
Okay. And then how does one decide to become a poet or an English teacher or a literary leader?
Well, if you're Russian and you don't love poetry, you have to give up your Russian credentials. You have to leave them at the door. That's it. You can't be a Russian. That's it. So my mother loved poetry, and she had poetry in her family and literature in her family. She was born at Lvov, but she was also on her mother's side Tolstoy. So her cousin was Leo Tolstoy. Her other cousin was Alexei Tolstoy, who is probably one of Russia's greatest poets. And so she grew up with poetry, and we had poetry in the house all the time. My mother would recite poetry. My father would recite poetry. He loved those big, epic poems. He memorized all those big army, military kinds of poems. But he would recite and kind of weep. And a big, huge guy. And I thought to myself, well, hell, this is not, in elementary school, all the girls wrote poetry. And the guys didn't touch poetry. That was a little too feminine, So, but my model was my father, who loved poetry and recited it, and I remember his voice. Ну, учитель, я Шевченко, ну, Владимир, что ж, посмотрю я без эдита, как ты проживешь. And that was all this epic poetry stuff. This is like the lays of the bogatirs, and they are the knights of the Round Table, the Russian traditional Round Table. And Vladimir is the emperor, and Ili, who's talking to him, says, I'm going to see, because Vladimir is kicking them all out, all these guys there, passe, and in the poem he said, Ilya Muramets, who's the knight, he says to Vladimir, the king, he says, I'll see how you get along without me. And it's a spectacular kind of poem, and I've always kind of memorized it and enjoyed it. And so the whole thing was very organic, Bob. It was what was part of my heritage, and I embraced it. And I've always loved poetry, and I've always written it. And when I was with the Warriors the first year here in San Francisco, a reporter named Sandy Padway for the Philadelphia Inquirer, somehow, I have no idea how he got a hold of this information that I liked poetry and I wrote it. And he was the first person to publish some of the poems that I wrote in the Philadelphia Inquirer.
So you were writing poems when you were in the NBA?
Oh, yes, absolutely, yeah. They were really bad. They were just awful, I mean, it's just like, Robert Frost turning over in his grave. I mean, it was just terrible.
Well, that's why, so Bill Russell says, Tom Macshery, a tough pro basketball player, was one of the most sensitive men I ever met. And that must have been, everybody knew you were a poet.
Right, and of course he could praise me because he blocked every shot I ever took.
But you were more of a defensive star, though.
I was sort of, yeah. But of course, I was a pretty decent shooter too until Rick Barry came along, and then they said, Macshery, I guess you're playing defense,
Oh, okay.
So because Rick Barry's here now, and
So you wrote poems there, and then later on, after your NBA career, didn't you meet? Was it Mark Strand?
Yeah, and I met Mark in my last year in Seattle. I went in an expansion draft up to Seattle, and I lived up there and played for the Seattle Sonics for 4 years. And there were a couple of guys that were Roger Sales, who was the really great Shakespearean scholar who taught at the University of Washington, was also kind of a Seattle nut. He loved Seattle Supersonic basketball nut. He had his own little radio show. And so he invited me, and he also had a poker game that he sponsored on Friday nights and so on. So I was on his show, and then I went to one of his poker games, and at that poker game, Mark Strand was there. Mark Strand was, at one time, the Poet Laureate of the United States, and he wasn't at that time, but he was teaching in the Rutke chair at the University of Washington, and he said, I understand you like poetry, and so we talked about poetry a little bit, and he said, well, why don't you come sit in one of my classes, and you don't have to be enrolled, just come and sit in there, and go on a road trip, come back if I'm, and that's what I did. So I just sort of, for that semester, I kind of sat in Mark's class, and that, Bob, changed me. Now that did change, because at that point, I had already written and published a book of poetry. It was called Over the Rim, and it was published by Saturday Review Press. And it was sort of a book of poems about the NBA cities. And I talked about the cities, and I kind of sort of wrote poetic descriptions of these cities and gave them, kind of animation. But they were not very good poems. I mean,
You're 25, 30, 35?
Yeah, I'm almost 30. I'm almost 30 by then. And so that book, I was really kind of cocky because they had an actual book reading. I had actually book signing. I thought I was a poet. And then I got that class. I took that class with Mark, and I realized, holy cow, I don't know anything about poetry, really. I just have been faking it. And so I began, he gave me the names of some poets to read, and he gave me one of the really best advice I've ever had, and that I always passed on to my students. Begin by writing like copying poets you like. And after a while, you'll begin to copy yourself. And I thought that was very smart. So he gave me a list of poets to read, and I really started to get into modern poetry. And then after I got out of basketball, I coached for a year in North Carolina. I can unequivocally say that Tom Macshery was the worst basketball coach in the history of professional sports.
Okay.
And not even close. And I hated every minute of it. I just did not want to be I just had no idea that I could hate coaching so much. Anyway, I would complain to Mark. We went on a road trip to New York, and I went out and had a couple of beers with Mark, and I said, Mark, I just have to get out of this thing. He said, well, look, I'll recommend you to the University of Iowa, to the Writers' Workshop. And I'm pretty sure, based on some of the poems they've written recently, that they'll accept you. So that's what I did. And I took our family from North Carolina, from Greensboro, where the North Carolina Cougars were located, and we drove to Iowa City and I enrolled at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop. And then, of course, that also sort of very similar to high school basketball. From that point on, things were much more organized and much more developed. I knew by the time I got out of Iowa that I knew enough about poetry that I would be able to write poems, hopefully good poems, but I knew I would never be able to stop writing poetry. and that's a good feeling. And
Yeah.
so, that's kind of the way it's gone. It's sort of poetry. It's been basketball, poetry, teaching. I got into teaching, which I do adore. So
Yeah. This was so around, you were at Iowa around 1980?
1970, 1970, 1972, 73, 74.
74.
2 years, yeah.
Yeah. And then you taught, and then you lived in the mountains of Truckee and Reno.
Yeah. I got back into basketball. It's a little convoluted. You have to pay the freight. There was no jobs, no poetry jobs after.
That is still true.
Still true. So there was a position open at the university with the Trailblazers, and Lenny Wilkins was the coach of the Trailblazers, and he was hired. And so he called me up and said, "You want to be my assistant?" And I said, "Okay." I got 3 children and the wife, and
Wow.
and I need to pay the bills, and I was looking forward to it because I liked the Northwest, and they had just drafted their number 1 draft choice, Bill Walton. So they were, I thought, oh well, my gosh, we're going to have the best center in the league.
Didn't they win the first year?
No, he got injured 2 years in a row. Then they fired Lenny, and then they hired I can't remember the name of the coach, and he won it all.
Oh, he won.
Yeah, right. By that time I was in Truckee and I owned a bookstore.
Okay. So you brought one poem along. Why don't you talk a little bit about the poem, and maybe we can hear. I still want to hear about your memoir too, but time is short. So maybe you want to try reading a poem.
Oh, sure, we'll give it a.
This is a fairly new one, I'm hearing.
Yeah, like I said, when you started it, Bob, I think Clear Path might be the last group of poems I write where I'm exclusively writing about sports. So Mel and I have been taking lots of trips to Europe since we've been married, and Mel is an artist. She's a wonderful artist, and so we decided we're going to collaborate on a group of poems about art. So I'm writing the poems, Mel's doing the sketches, and we're a work in progress, and hopefully it'll turn out. And this is the one poem. It's called Color, and it's for my friend Del Martin. We mined pigments out of the earth's minerals and mud, and squeezed color out of plants and insects into bowls. A pestle and imagination did the rest. Somewhere I read 10,000 shellfish had to die to make enough purple to dye Cleopatra's dress. And a tribe in Namibia does not have a name for blue. Can you imagine? How can I describe my baby's eyes without the color blue? My wife's colors arrive in tubes of even one color. Red, for example, assumes that the eye can see the difference between a fire engine and Superman's red cape. Somewhere a computer is generating over 10 million hues of the rainbow into the universe. Can the retina absorb so many possibilities? Some early civilizations divide colors into warm and cold. Warm earth, cold sky. The Australian Aboriginal define color as light and dark. The Polynesians describe color as fresh and dry, not wet and dry. Did they believe that color could spoil like fruit? Once on a summer job painting houses with a friend, I saw him dip his finger into his bucket, bring the finger up to his nose, and sniff, and frown, and say, "Old paint."
So that's Color. Wow, what a cool poem.
Yeah, I just love the fact that there are these societies that just define color in so many different ways. They, how could they possibly,
We read an article that, because you mentioned that a tribe in Namibia doesn't have a word for blue. The Greeks didn't have a color for blue. And that's why, at least this is one theory, that's why it was always the wine dark sea.
Oh,
Because they didn't have blue, they didn't say blue. They didn't have a word for it back in the Homeric Greek.
is that true? That's wonderful.
That's what one of the translators
I
wrote.
got to remember that.
I'll send you that article.
Okay, I would love to see it. I'd love that.
Is that about right? Yeah. Joy, I wanted to check with my other producer. Oh, that's a great poem. So you've been doing, so now you're doing, and I remember you did some poems to Mel's paintings maybe 5-6 years ago. You were just starting to do that.
Yeah, I've sort of messed around a little bit with that, but this is a little bit better organized because we went on a couple of trips where we actually were with a artist who kind of taught us a little bit about, taught me. Mel probably knew more than he did, actually. But he knew travel drawing, which was a lot of fun to do. It's just very quick sketches. We did some watercoloring, and I was along for the ride. I'm not an artist. I took Mel's classes. She's a great teacher. So I wound up being able to draw a reasonable portrait of a, but clearly it's my job is the poetry. It's her job to do the art.
But you collaborate, you do poetry to her art and vice versa? Not so much versa.
Yeah, Mel actually has her jobs cut out. The poor woman has to do all this editing for all these fiction books that I'm writing, these mysteries and the memoir. I don't know how many times she's edited the memoir. She's probably as sick of it as I am.
But it's done. It's coming out in October.
It is. It's done, and and I think it's a good one. I think it's very political, Bob. It was written primarily during COVID and during the Trump administration, and being an immigrant, I had to make some very political statements about how Trump treated immigrants, and so it's also there's a lot of poems in there. I included a lot of my own poetry. And in a sense, it's more of an autobiography than a memoir, because it takes in every aspect and a series of my life.
And so there's a memoir coming out. You've got a series of mystery novels.
I do. I got the Brevelli brothers. They're still cooking. They're still solving crimes. And 1968, the first book starts in 1968, and now that was the case of the 61 Impala that's out just now is the case of the 66 Mustang. You'll notice the car themes here.
Indeed.
Yeah, and then the next book is coming out in January, and that's called the case of the Volkswagen Hippie bus. So that's going to come out in January, and then the memoir is coming out in October, right before this coming basketball season. So that should be kind of fun.
And I've seen I think there's two of the Brevelli brothers books are already available.
Yes, they are.
They're on Amazon or?
They're on Amazon. They're on my website. But Amazon is probably the best way to get them, or go to your local bookstore and order it. They'll be happy to get the book for you. They're good. I think they're really fun mysteries. I think the Brevelli brothers are good amateur sleuths. It's not like a detective mystery, and it's not a real private eye. In other words, they're not licensed detectives, but they solve crimes for their friends in the neighborhood. Sort of. It's a little bit Agatha Christie, in that way.
Yeah. The best private investigators never are the cops, right? They're always on the side,
right?
Kind of working underneath, sometimes against, but
right, exactly.
So. One of our earlier guests, Catherine Holbein, I know you know Catherine,
right.
And she says, we write because it makes our lives better. We write because it makes our lives better, just for the sheer love of writing. And I get that so much from you that you grew up with poems and stories, and you just need to make stories. You need to, it's just there, whether it's talked about poetry as kind of flashes of intensity or having to get, high energy to write poems, but whereas writing a novel is more, laying the groundwork and just kind of moving steadily ahead, just kind of moving ahead on all fronts.
Yeah, the fiction's a little bit like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. Once you're through you get through you have to start all over again because, so it's a real slog. Don't fiction is a slog. Poetry can be earth-shattering because it doesn't take a whole long period of time to get a good poem, but it can devastate you because one misplaced word can ruin a poem. So it's a different kind of intensity that you have to write poetry. It's long term for fiction. It's short term, but more like harakiri on the poetry end of things. And I don't think I could. I don't know what I'd do without poetry, and I don't know what I would do without basketball. I'm really pretty much of a basketball nutcase. I mean, Mel knows where to find me during basketball season. I'm in front of that TV watching the Warriors and watching this season, and I love the Kings. They're my second best team, and I'll always be the Warrior fan. But the Kings are all the favorites of Melanie and her family, so I particularly enjoy them also. And so sports, top of my list, of course, is Melanie. And then after that, everything else falls into place.
Well, I was thinking about reading Cassandra, which I think is a poem.
Oh, would you read it? I'd love to hear somebody else read it.
Not exactly about, but and I thought about this because here, there's 31. It's in Some Men.
Oh, it is. Oh.
So this is dedicated to Melanie.
Okay, good. I'm excited to hear somebody else read it. I've read it all the time, so.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure. I think I've heard it. I've heard you read it, but it just kind of grabbed me this morning. So, Cassandra, for Melanie. Sometimes I feel as if I'm living in Troy, and Cassandra, a.k.a. girlfriend, soon-to-be wife, is pronouncing certain doom throughout the house and out into the neighborhood. Where am I? I'm somewhere within the walls of her fears, mutant germs ready to spring from the clothes I wore to the hospital, the truck turning on my right, her side, about to send us into oncoming traffic, and the thieves and rapists who will strike the minute I forget to lock our front door. You have been living in the country too long, she says. Life in a city is not as safe as before. Life is not safe in her kitchen either. Botulism resides in her refrigerator or beneath the sink. She refuses to name whatever she believes lurks in the pipes waiting to leap onto her dishes. She purifies them in water, hot as lava. Wear rubber gloves, she says. And outdoors, remember, the world is blooming with allergies. Wear a mask. You will save yourself thousands of doctor's fees. When I tell her she's being a paranoid, she answers, did Priam listen? Did Hector? Look what happened to the Trojan women. It is clear I will not convince her, and never will. The omens are too strong and all around us, and are far too many to ignore. Remember the wooden horse, she says, and suddenly I understand the extent of her love for me, that she could have left me outside the gates of her city, but has risked her life to let me in.
Yay, you did a great job, Bob.
Thank you.
Great job.
It wasn't easy. It's a mouthful of a poem. So, Tom, we're going to wrap up. Any thought? Your future writing world?
Well, I've got a lot of mysteries to write. I have two manuscripts that are finished in a really reasonably good first draft. They're going to be, and I'm working on the sixth in the series. So the fourth and the fifth are done, and then I have a wonderful sort of espionage novel also completely done, and that's set in a senior living facility. So it's kind of comedic, and it's also at the same time a little bit of an espionage story, and I'm excited about that. And so, and I'm hoping that Dubs will do the right thing, and then we'll get back, and Melanie and I can go on a parade again. So we'll be very busy. We're busy people, and I've pretty much set some goals, at least at least 3 or 4 more books. I'm, not a spring chicken anymore, so I don't know beyond 3 or 4 more books whether what I can do. But I'm optimistic.
All right. Well, it's always a pleasure to hear about what you're working on, and thank you for joining us here at Coffee and Poets.
Great. Thanks, Bob, and thank you for reading Cassandra. It was just wonderful to hear it with another voice and another take on it.
All right. Well, we'll do it again. And you're reading here in a couple of weeks?
Yeah. Yep,
so
yep.
We'll have a little more poetry. So
Good.
Thanks to our producer, Lawrence Dinkins, and Twin Lotus Ty, and my guest, Tom Macshery. This is Coffee and Poets for May 2024, and we'll hope to hear you soon. Thanks again,
Good.
Tom.
Looking forward to it.